Hey, what's up guys, it's Bronson. Now today's video is part 2 of our ongoing leg sleeve. We're going to be tattooing a realistic lion on top of the female portrait that we did in the previous video, which is labeled part 1. If you haven't already seen that, jump back and check that out first so you can follow us along on the journey. Now in this video, I'm also going to be sharing my thought process and some pro tips to help all of you guys out along the way. But enough of all that, let's get into it. Okay guys, so just getting into our stencil here. Firstly, just wiping down the area with an alcohol wipe, making sure that that's nice and sterile, and then applying some stencil product. And I'm using stencil jam here. It's pretty good, especially for these inkjet styled stencils. So now I'm just making sure that that's lining up really nicely with all the work that's below it, and then pushing that on. Now a huge piece of advice when using these inkjet styled stencils is using an alcohol wipe and pushing that firmly onto your stencil, really holding it there for a little bit, and you can really rub that quite vigorously without it budging any of the stencil. But you'll see here now my stencil appears a lot darker through the paper. So that alcohol wipe really helps to push that pigment from your stencil onto the skin. I found without that step that a lot of these stencils go on really lightly. So yeah, that's a huge tip and a real must do if you are using this type of stencil. So you can see here it's looking pretty dark. Now it's still not as good as a hand stencil. It's not as dark and it doesn't stick as good, but I can get onto the skin a lot faster with the stencil. So now looking at our healed result from the previous session, everything's all in there really nice and a good healed result. And then here's the day ahead of us, so let's get into that. So we are starting off with a 23 mag, the biggest needle that I have out today. And I've received a lot of messages and a few comments on how to do fur and stuff like that, so this is going to be a great video for all of you guys that are a little bit curious and wanting to improve your kind of textures. So here I'm just starting off with the whiskers and this bottom right side, starting off with my biggest forms and really mapping and blocking all of these shapes in. Now there wasn't a lot of big shapes or big forms here, so there was really no fast way of getting through this without cutting out some detail, which I really didn't want to do. I always find that a little bit of detail in these shadows looks really nice in the end result, and especially that healed, and you're giving your client a more honest result, I think. But it is really important to still stay using your largest needle grouping, especially at the start of the tattoo, just really trying to get as much ground gained as possible. This tattoo was pretty slow for me. I find like the fur isn't something that you can rush. It's not like there's smooth areas that you can kind of blast over with some good tricks or technique. You really just have to put every little hair in the right place. So there was no fast way of getting this tattoo done, unfortunately. But still here, really just focusing on having a solid foundation and good technique, making sure that the areas that I'm tattooing, I'm packing them in black, really nice and solid on that first pass if I can, is the best way to productively move through a piece like this. So still just mapping in all of these areas, and I won't get into the fur texture right now because there's some other parts coming up in the video that is a little bit better for that. So if you want that information, do stick around. And I'm approaching this how I usually would, getting my dark tones in and then coming back with my lighter tones soon. I'm just going to speed up some of this next part so we can get into something a little bit more interesting than just packing black and in this really tight fiddly area. And you'll see I'm doing all of these shapes still with my 23 round mag. And you could use a liner for this, but my reasoning for using the mag is there's so many transitions in the value and so many different values behind or underneath the whisker. So if you're using a mag, I feel like there's so much more control to stop and start these dark tones, and then where the whisker joins on to the face of the lion, you can really lightly whip the edge of that whisker out, rather than it just being a hard line kind of connecting onto the lion. I don't think that there's anything too wrong with the look of doing it with a liner, but I just know using my mag to do this, I think it's giving the most honest result, and not shortening any detail for my client on the tattoo that they're going to receive. I really want to do the best job I can, and I think that this way is it for me. And now you can see this area is starting to get a little bit more interesting and a little bit more built up. Now I'm using more of a mid-tone to get some more of these whiskers, especially as they get closer to the lion's face. Not only does that depth change on the sharpness of the whisker, it's also that value is now dropping to something a lot lighter. So it's kind of starting from the black where that whisker is really far away and there's a lot of depth behind that whisker, starting from that darker tone, and then as it gets closer there's a little bit more depth behind there on a fur texture and another layer that's sitting behind there. And if you use a liner, I think it's really easy to skip that little bit of depth. So using these values and this mag is really true to the reference. So you'll see here coming up shortly, I also use my mag to do a lot of this fur texture, especially some of the stuff that's a little bit out of focus is great for the mag. So having my mag side on like that and slowly cutting in little hairs, it's a great way to let the needle do the work for you. It's something that the mag wants to do. And here softly getting these whiskers to join onto the lion's face there. And if you are doing soft actions, I do like a little bit of a darker value. So just getting in and finalizing some of this form. So here we are getting into a new area just above the lion's teeth, but the technique is still the same. I have a little bit of shadow created from that depth where the lion's face starts onto the teeth. So I can get that black value quite confidently in there. Now looking back at this, I actually feel like this process would have been a lot faster if I used a little bit of a lighter value and I could have more confidently placed that up and whipped these lighter hairs up. Here I'm being really fiddly with the black tone, so just even critiquing myself, there is a better way to do this here. I think if I started with that mid-tone, focusing on the top of that shadow where all these hairs are joining up, and then after that mid-tone's in, I could have much more confidently put my black in below that. And again here, using that black. This is alright here because I am working really in that shadow and just out from it. So that's probably the right thing to do there. But even these little bits, I'm kind of overusing this black a little bit. Just really trying to punch that in and get all of this completed. This is all pretty simple, mapping in this nice dark shadow here. And it's really important for these shadows to sometimes not overcomplicate them. This is such a hectic image, like there's so much texture and so much detail. So I don't want complicated shadows. If your lights and midtones are really complicated, then I would recommend really making your super black shadows just packed in really well and just focus on that. If there's a little bit of detail in that shadow, you can make that decision. If it's really important, keep it there. And there might have been parts in that black that I just packed, but it's really important to create that strong foundation of the shape of the lion. So I need all of my blacks to put in that structure. So from afar, viewing the tattoo, you can really easily see the shape and what this tattoo is. And now getting started on these teeth, I'm using a value that I'm comfortable mapping with, something quite light, and just getting in these strong forms that I can see from my reference. And try and really focus on how I'm using my mag. You'll see I always vary how my mag is turned on what form I'm trying to create, and also my hand speed. Here creating that nice little curve from that shadow, just repeating that motion softly across, making that shape and that form quite strong. kind of like you're just slowly carving that form in every pass, making it a little bit sharper or darker. Because each little pass is going to just saturate the skin that much more, really just building in and slowly developing that form and building that up until it's final, rather than trying to just rush in and create that value straight away. And if your work's looking a little bit flat in some of these areas and some of your values just all look really similar and there's not much depth to the object that you're trying to create, usually that would be the step. You just want to slow down a little bit and really build up these shapes. Even in the small areas, you want to create an impressive result, and that really is done by slowly developing these tones and just putting as much information into that small area as you can, rather than just getting one tone and doing a dark to light gradient of that. So now that most of the body of these shadows is all built up, I can focus on getting my level of saturation right. Now there was no high highlight sitting in these teeth, so just a few quick passes with a really light tone set the depth of where these teeth are sitting in the reference perfectly. And now here with a 13 round mag, I'm just focusing on my next value in from this dark shadow, so getting some of my mids and dark tones in before I can move on with my lights. Now when you're working like this, you really want to consider your negative space in your reference and make sure that you're not hitting it, because that's so important in your tattoo, to have the right level of black and also the right level of negative space. Just like the black shadow of the nose, the negative space is really important to creating the form of this lion, so it can't be interrupted too much without you losing the overall form of this lion. And now we're getting into our light tones in this area, so I'm really just focusing on the overall depth that's there and how sharp these kind of hairs are, creating that texture with my mag, and also working on that tone and level of saturation that sits beyond that. So that was still quite far to the right, so there's still a little bit of shadow coming in from the side of the lion. And now just starting to work a little bit higher on the reference and this top shadow here. It's a great situation if you can get your darks kind of above and below where you're working. It's going to make it much easier to read your reference and see where these values are really sitting. So just starting to map that in and confirm some of these blacks as well. Now, like I talked about before, I really want to simplify this shadow, but one thing that I need to respect is that edge of the shadow where it's joining onto the fur. I want to create these small cuts with my mag to give that hair-like look. It's really going to soften up the edge of that shadow. And in some places, I'll really slowly drag that mag if I want to create a more prominent looking few hairs in from that shadow. So here, as the nose is working a little bit higher up, that dark shadow kind of starts to get a little bit more complex as it's working out from the kind of edge of the nose there. Really focusing on just the fur and making sure that I'm respecting that area, and then I can kind of more confidently pack in this other part once I've worked in the edge of that shadow. Again here, just mapping in that kind of nostril area, and then once I've created the edge of that shadow, I can just go in and blast that area pretty confidently. And here's quite a good example of what the mag's capable of doing for getting these finer looking hairs in. You can see a little bit of gentle work with that mag really does create the perfect level of depth with these hairs. And it's always much more productive if you can be using one needle to do all of these tasks. You can use it for packing and then also gently cutting in the shape and direction of these hairs. And that to me is actually one of the most important things whenever I'm doing any animal with fur, is really just seeing what direction the fur is going in. If you can turn your mag in that direction and create the form that way, I think it's always a really accurate result to your reference. Now this part of the lion I think is really important, and quite often it's messed up in the tattoos. And that is where the whiskers join onto the lion's face in these kind of like crevice-like parts, and there are kind of some dark dots where the whisker kind of does cut in a little bit deeper. but I like to get in first with the tone that's sitting behind all of the detail and all the information that might kind of make you think otherwise and make you just want to jump in and put some black little dots. If you can focus on the value that's behind all the information first, and that value that's really saturating that general area, and then after you've kind of mapped in that direction and the general form of what's going on there, then you can make a much better decision to not overwork your black and just to really accurately put that in, because I think there's not a lot of black that's actually sitting there. Perhaps just a few little cuts in where the whisker's really there. And I think it's probably a lot of bad tattoos that's made people think that way, to kind of just get some black cut into that shape. But really, if you were to actually see a lion, even photographs of a full-bodied lion, there's never really any black sitting in that area. It's just a kind of like dark shadow, kind of like that crevice that's on the face there of the cheeks. But now you can see, using a 9 mag, I can confidently and really accurately put in small hits of black rather than overdoing it and trying to stretch my black value out to do more work than it should be doing. And even though it's easy with the black, you can kind of lightly whip it out to create that softer shade. It's just not as true, and you can't really saturate that tone as well as I can with a lighter tone, and the tone that's really there. I can confidently just pack that in to create a really nice healed result, rather than trying to dust any value in and kind of cheat that process. Okay, so now that I'm happy with all of my darker tones in this area, I can work on finalizing this spot using my lighter values to create this illusion and direction on the fur, making all of these passes in the right direction, kind of angling all that hair in towards the line and towards the nose. And you'll see at first my passes are quite lazy. They're really just focusing on making it easy for the viewer to see the direction. But this is still, with my lighter tone, this is almost like my background level of saturation in this area. I'll still pass through here and make some sharper looking hairs in that direction where needed. But for now, really just focusing on getting that level of saturation right. And here I'm actually just focusing on my negative space. That's what's in my head more than this value is. I'm more seeing where my negative space is and kind of blocking that in here with this value. So you'll see all my passes are quite lazy. There's not a lot of shape in them. It is more of a saturating pass. And then after I've saturated that area to the right amount, I can see, is there a little bit more depth that needs to be added? But as I'm completing these areas, I kind of keep needing to move up a little bit, both to save my stencil and just to start the next section and the next shadows that are going to complete the area that I'm passing out of. And then once that step's complete and this area is kind of blocked off, I can really look at it and see what it needs now. So you can see now I'm using a slightly darker value as well. And again, just really focusing on the direction of this hair at all times. I really like this value that I've got here. It's kind of a little bit darker than a light tone, but it's so versatile to use. And it's great when you're doing quite a soft object, because you can still float your needle a little bit, but it's also putting in something that's quite permanent there. So now I can use this value to add a lot more depth into what I'm doing and get some of these more final strokes of hair in. And now we're on to the other side of the lion. Finally, I'm pretty certain I'm just gonna speed up heaps of this side. But this part here is actually quite cool. It's a little bit simpler than the other side where these whiskers are lying. There's no real fur going on behind this part of the whisker. So it's quite nice to see some easy mapping in with this mag. And it's definitely a lot more fun to tattoo than all that really tight, slow detail. I feel like that other side honestly took me ages. And I didn't want to skip through any of that kind of knowledge or information that might be there for some of you guys to gain. Otherwise, it's kind of like, what's the point in doing this video in general? I found when I was editing it, I was like, man, this is taking so long and there's not a lot of new stuff happening. It's all kind of like, it's more fur and more fur. But, yep. I guess that's actually pretty much what a lion is like some fur with eyes. Okay, but let's just speed up heaps of this. Okay, but just to kind of cement in some important knowledge here, I am using a lighter value to get in that depth where the whisker is. So to get in that information first, just using that lighter value, making all of that pass and direction in before I go in with any black value. It's going to make it much easier for me to make a really accurate decision on where those small little hits of black should be. And here, just finalizing the shadows on the left side of this nose. It's quite simple on the nose side. It's a little bit of a harder edge, but do make sure you take your time on kind of whipping that hair and that mag out in that right direction. You really want to see the direction on your reference and just replicate that onto your image. And now with the top of the nose, I'm using a 13 round mag and a black value to put these hair-like cuts in where the nose is transitioning from that darker value onto the fur. So making sure even here that the direction is right. And now this is some real-time footage, so you can see my kind of hand speed in the direction of what I'm doing with this mag. Just really slowly and precisely working on the shapes of these hairs and not overworking my value there as well. So I can come back with that lighter value and put the top of that in. But while I'm on my blacks, kind of stepping down and completing more of this nose. And similar to the right side of the lion that we had just completed, I want to cap it with that top shadow before I can finalize my level of saturation and what's really going on the nose itself. And then after I've built up a good amount of direction and detail with my blacks, I can then go in with my lighter tones and start saturating a lot more. So here, finalizing some of these black areas and then a large saturating pass, creating that shadow on the darker side of the lion. So now I have just skipped completing that bottom left side. I feel like there wasn't too much for you guys to gain there that we hadn't already gone over. But since it's not on film, just like last time, that means that it was completed by another artist who's way better than me. So thanks to that guy. Anyway, so the way that I'm approaching this area is the same as we've hit a lot of these other spots and the edge of that nose. So I'm working on firstly getting in my dark shadow and working in a lot of these areas and these forms that you can see from your reference. It's quite easy to get distracted by all that's going on. Like these references of the lions has so much information in the reference. So just making that simpler for myself, I'm just using my black and the 13 brown mag and almost just kind of doing a rush map through on this area. You can see that the black that I'm putting in isn't heavily packed unless I know that that's definitely what's going on. But then it allows some form of something to work off, to get all these other values to pull out of. There's a little bit of shadow there that's anchored there for me to then build off. And now that all of that information is locked in, sitting center on the reference, I can focus on working up to this eye. And again, once I've got this general direction in, then that's making it really simple for me to just step up all the way to the eye and just complete that area, because I know what information is in between these two parts from the eye to the edge of that lion there. So using a larger mag to really softly get that nice shadow in where it does cut in towards the eye, and also work out from a lot of these shadows. Putting in the black where I know that it's definite, but still focusing on the direction of the fur. I really can't stress that enough. That is the most important thing when creating a realistic lion tattoo, is just really focusing on the direction that all of this fur is going in. If you have that there, it's not really too different from any other portrait with the aspects that are involved. And I'm really working on just saturating this lower area with this great kind of muddy light tone and putting in some of these blacks that are really permanent here, working out from that shadow before I move on to some of these finer details and mapping in the eye. And still just using my mag for mapping in this eye, it's creating a really nice amount of depth and no decision that's too permanent with my sharpness. I can always go back in with a liner and create some section that's a little bit sharper, but I find with most realistic images, a nice soft edge, and especially on these rounder shapes, it looks a lot more natural. And once I've made a full pass around this eye, mapping in the rough area, I can then step back through and pack in what I know is a true black value. And your smaller mags like your 13 or 9s are great for making a really well saturated and packed black value. And now just focusing on some of the form and the edges of these small shapes within the eye before I can move on to my next stage. So getting all of this prepared for a lighter value and some higher level of saturation to be passed through. And now that that's kind of locked in there, I can start to focus on a little bit of these shapes that are outside of the eye as well, as I'm going to be spending a little bit of time on the eye and the area that's lower than it. I'm going to need to lock in some of this information with my stencil. And this is the darker side of the line as well. So I always tend to find that these sides, it does take a little bit longer, but it's great if you can get this side knocked out first, because the other side has so much more negative space. You can see in my reference that's sitting beside us here, there's so much more negative space on that side. So it really does mean a little bit less work there. I don't like to have these lazy shadows in. I just can't help but put in like all this little detail that I see. And I think obviously working like that, you'll get a lot further in tattooing. And I'd love to know down in the comments like where you guys are at with your career. Are you fresh to tattooing? Or do you even tattoo, you know? Or you're just here to kind of watch some videos because it's real late and you're just on this weird ass part of YouTube and now you're just locked in part of this community for life. But if that is you, man, put your phone down and just go to bed, okay? Nah, yeah, I'd actually love to kind of know where you guys are at in your career. Are you fresh to it? Or are you maybe just learning more about realism? Maybe you're doing your apprenticeship. At the moment, the channel's at a cool spot, you know. I've really got the time to reply to every comment that comes through. So I think that's a luxury, you know, for you guys to just be able to ask anything. Even if you've got more of a question about technique or anything about tattooing, you can always just fire that through to my Instagram as well. I think I've got back to all of you guys, or most of you on there. I get heaps of my work messages on my Instagram, so sometimes it gets a bit flooded. But yeah, I'll always take the time to kind of make sure that I'm getting back to you guys and helping out where I can, you know. Pretty genuine about just wanting to help other people out and maybe inspire some other people to start tattooing or just to better what they're doing, and putting a little bit more thought into it so that everyone can create a better tattoo, you know. And I always have this thought like I obviously try real hard to do the best tattoos, but sometimes I feel like maybe my journey will be more about creating someone in the next generation who's gonna be like the best, you know. And maybe they'll start out from watching these videos, or there'll be a huge impact to them to really getting a good understanding on and a grasp of all this technique early on in their career, which will help them to just like smash it, you know. So I always feel, yeah, like maybe my purpose in tattooing is more just to help fuel someone else, you know, the same way a lot of these other artists have for me. I don't think I'll be the world's best, but I'll give it my best try, you know. But I feel like someone else who's so passionate about tattooing will be like drilling through and grabbing all this information from everywhere, like a little bit of YouTube and a little bit of whatever else they can find out there. and that's a huge you know, thing to do. And it's also good for other artists, you know, if you're in that position, man, don't gatekeep it. Like, that's just lame. Just help other people out. I want to see everyone that's around me do way better than me if they can. Probably can't though, I'm pretty mean, but no. But that would be something that's so rewarding for me, you know, is for everyone that's part of this YouTube community to just in a year's time just be like a completely different artist, you know, have improved their work like tenfold, you know. Okay, so we've got quite a cool part of the tattoo going down. We are applying a little bit of sharper texture. Now that I've created these blunt kind of forms and stuff mapped in, I can create something a little bit more interesting, especially now we're getting onto the lighter side of the tattoo. It's great to have this texture be a little bit of contrast to everything else that's been going on in the tattoo, which is all quite smooth and really in unison. You know, this is gonna create something like a spanner in the works, something that's really gonna stand out, and it's just so contrasting to everything else that we've been doing. And you can see this is done with a liner. It looks pretty sharp, so I think this is a 5-round liner, and you can see it's with a black tone. It's going to create something that's really gravelly looking, so something, you want something really dark for this. And you can see my hand speed and movement is just really random and quite fast. I want to create something kind of inconsistent that looks like organic and natural. I don't want any slow kind of nice passes. I want to create that kind of rough texture. And it's great for this part of the nose because I think the fur here is a lot shorter. So rather than trying to put in all these nice little flicks, I want to create a little bit of texture and like age for the lion. And it's always, I've been doing this for a while now with my lion portraits, and it's like my favorite part of it. And I think it sets my work aside a little bit as well from other artists doing it this way. A lot of people just do their fur texture so nice and smooth. But I think especially with a lion, you know, you want to think about what you're tattooing. It's like, it's quite a strong animal, so you want to give it like a little bit of roughness, some kind of like scarred up look. You don't want it looking too like perfect and pretty, in my opinion. But this is one of those textures I think is so cool, but you don't want to overdo it. You want it to be in a small area of the tattoo, perhaps quite center, where you know the hairs are quite short, maybe, yeah, just in that nose spot. If you overdo it, it's going to take away from that impact that it has on the image, just in that small area. And also, if you have it too wide on your portrait, that's not really where the sharpness should be. You want all that really strong, sharp detail to be sitting center and kind of just blurring out a little bit, especially past the eyes. I don't like too much sharpness. That's another reason why I won't use these liners for getting in some of the fur and stuff that's on the edge. I'd rather just use a mag and take my time doing it that way. It's going to create that correct amount of softness and depth that's supposed to be in that area. But now we're just spending a little bit more time in this area, just finalizing it before we move on to the eye. And now, just like the other side, we're going to use our mag to map in this eye. My hand's kind of massively in the way there, but the lion's eye is pretty simple. Like, we just have that round shape that is pretty confidently surrounded by a true black tone that's there. There's a little bit of other information there, but yeah, all pretty simple. And then working on a little bit of detail that's outside of it. Just like the other side, I want to lock in a little bit of that information that's around the area that I'm going to be spending a bit of time, because that will wipe off our stencil. Especially these inkjet stencils, they actually don't hold very well. I have to stay pretty careful to not be wiping over them too much. And I really enjoy tattooing this side of the portrait where there's a lot more light. That negative space really makes the direction of this fur and these small little cuts that you put in with your mag, they just look really powerful next to that negative space. So just working my way up with both my value and level of saturation, again kind of overusing that light opaque-ish tone there, and then I can move in with that level of saturations up and push some of these shadows out, just making sure that they're pushed out in the direction of the fur, that there's no hard line that's left there from any of my early mapping. Just focusing on getting all of that flicked out in the right direction. And now we're on to a pretty cool part of the tattoo. This is all super easy to tattoo after you've just been like slugging it out through all of this really tight knit stuff. Even in some of those other sections, like, it's just hard to gain ground fast, you know, because you can only work up so much before you have another shadow or another fold start. And it's just not just a simple fold, there's a texture there as well. It's like tattooing silk in comparison to like a knitted jumper. Like, you've got detail to add into this depth of layers as well. But this part, yeah, it's really nice and straightforward. Just focusing on the direction. I'll use a value that's a little bit lighter and get in a nice early mapping stage. And then I can put in some more permanent hits in there. And even being above the eyes, I wouldn't even want a bunch more detail to sit there to distract from any of the information that's below it. So now, as soon as you're past this part and you get above the eye height, I've still got a little bit of hard work to go, but as soon as I'm above that eye height, I want all my detail to start loosening up a little bit as well, to kind of magnify the eye into all of that detail that's sitting central in the piece. And I already knew from looking at this reference of the tattoo that I'm doing that my lights and my mids are going to be really heavily textured with all of this fur shape. And also the image is quite highly saturated as well. So you really need to build a strong image and see what's important as well. That's such a huge part of tattooing, is just creating a strong reference and also having that knowledge there if you can do any decisions throughout the tattoo to make a stronger looking tattoo and a better looking tattoo. And that's actually a video that I want to do shortly for you guys. I think that the most important thing about tattooing is just reading your reference well and seeing small areas where you can improve that. And it's something that's so important. I really want to take my time making that video because I think it is probably the most important tip that you could give anyone when it comes to realism tattooing. Really having the understanding of what makes a realistic image strong and also how to read your values. It's something that sounds so simple, but I think it's just a subject that's hugely overlooked in the tattoo industry. When I think of a perfect image, I don't really think about something that a tattooist is creating a lot of the time. I'd think more about maybe a old like film photograph. And personally, I think that there's so much to gain from photographers and there's so much knowledge to be brought into the tattoo industry from these guys. No one really knows a perfect image and how to balance their values more than a photographer. So quite often I'll look at steps that some of these photographers are making to improve their image. You know, everyone starts off with this raw photo, but it's all of their editing decisions and knowledge that's really going to set their work aside from everyone else's and just create a strong looking image in general. So it might be a great idea for you guys to do something similar. Just find some nice maybe portrait photographers or whatever subject matter that you're into and see what's going on in the image that wouldn't be there on just a normal kind of phone photo. What have they done to step up this image, and what aspects of the image do they find important enough to really bring out more? Oh, I didn't even really realize we are onto our white highlights. That's sick. We've made it. I remember even on this day, this was like a big day. Oh yeah, and the camera was blurry at this part. That's also nice. So but we're using a 7-round liner. We are just slowly packing that in, and then in these larger areas using a 9 mag to really make sure that that white is packed in there solid. I'll also use a little bit of white over some of the values that are in the eye. So some of these lighter tones I'll pass over with the white to create that nice transition. But just like on a portrait, I don't like to overdo my white. I think if you've tattooed it well, the tattoo doesn't even need the white, but it just helps a little bit, you know. Sorry about the camera being blurry there, guys. It was a massive day. I should have double checked that, but let's have a look at the finished result. Thank you guys for making it to the end of the video. I really appreciate everyone's ongoing support with the channel, and I hope that there were some tips there that you can apply into your own tattooing. I'll see you guys in the next video.